Good morning and welcome to the Morning Devo with Bowo. It's May 17th, 2021. We are in for another week of the devotions, and we are in the book of First Corinthians, as you see right there. First Corinthians. So you can always check out the archives of the Devo by just going to my YouTube channel at Bo Willette. And they're all there. Man, all the books that we've done. Actually, not all the early ones that we did. I don't think those are up there, but we're missing maybe a few books that we've already gone through. But hey, we'll go through them again. So many good things. So for this week's edition of the Morning Devo with Bowo, let's do it. Let's just start in. Chapter 7. Very cool chapter. One that certainly is quite humbling in a lot of ways. So, hey, good morning, CCF Men's Fellowship. Hope you guys are doing great. And it says, now about those questions you asked in your latter letter, my answer is that if you do not marry, it is good. First thing I get is that it's not afraid to ask questions this morning. That's a good thing. Now, we have a Q&A kind of Bible answer man kind of ministry called A Reason for Hope, and you could always check that out on this YouTube channel between 5 and 6 Monday through Friday, where if you have Bible questions, we'll do our best to answer them. All my friends, Sean, Peter, Scott, and sometimes even I myself am on there. Um, but it's good to ask questions, and it's good for us, even those that do these shows. It's always good for us to ask questions. We always need to be in a place, I think, where it's where we're able to ask questions and delve into trying to find more answers. Sometimes we can get this attitude that we know all the answers, and really, we don't know all the answers. We can do our best to answer questions, but sometimes our knowledge is limited as far as the whole scope of everything you can know about that answer. Um, but we do our best, obviously. But I love the Corinthian heart here is where they wrote a letter to Paul, and they had questions on the Christian life. And sometimes, we want to know maybe the will of God, or the Corinthians didn't have like a Bible like we have all these Bibles, and I find it so fascinating that in my house I have these different versions of the Bible, and I love reading the different versions and gaining insights into things, and I have all these books around, and the Corinthian church just didn't have that. And so they had questions about their life and how what does it mean to follow Yeshua, Jesus, the rabbi, you know, from Israel. What does that mean? What does that look like? And so they asked Paul, who was a rabbi in his own right, um, and obviously they had questions about relationships. Um, and one of them obviously had to do with marriage. Now he says, my answer is that if you do not marry, it is good. So obviously that a question was, is it okay not to marry, or is it okay to marry? What would Yahshua say? What is God's will in that? And he says it is good, but usually it is best to be. But usually it is best to be married, each man having his own wife, and each woman having her own husband, because otherwise you might fall back into sin. So you get kind of this really cool insight into this chapter, into just the relationship between the Corinthian church and Paul. Very personal, very down to the nitty gritty kind of talks, and I love that. I hope that you have people in your life that you can talk about real issues, um, things that really matter in your life. And I love that people were wondering, like, hey, is it good for me not to marry? What is God's will for me? And that's such a good question for all of us. Hey, should I get married? Should I not get married? How can I please the Lord? And you get the idea that that was something that was in the hearts of the Corinthians. How can I honor God, maybe? And is it better not to marry? Is sex actually, marriage, the idea of sexual relationships, is that a good thing? Is it not good? Is it good for us to just be celibate? And is that the way to go? And we all know that the church over when we look at the history of the church, that the church has gone different routes with this idea, right? Is sex good? Is sex bad? I'm not going to get into an interesting history of sex right here, but it certainly has taken some wild turns in the life of the church and in the life of outside the church, um, how sexual relationships have looked. But we are sexual beings, and we like to be around each other. And obviously, um, Paul says, "Hey, nothing's wrong with being married," and he says it's good to be married. And that way each person has their own wife, and a wife has their own husband. And I love how Paul says that, huh? He says, "Hey, let each husband have his own wife, and each wife have her own husband." He doesn't just talk to the husbands, but he's talking to the wives too. They each have kind of a right and that, yeah, I guess you would call it like a right to be able to marry someone, and that would be God's will. And obviously, it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? One man, one woman for life, this kind of idea. And he says so that you don't fall back into sin. Obviously, maybe it sounds like fornication, that idea of just sleeping with people, that kind of idea. Don't fall back into that old pattern, and that for a lot of people, that is an old pattern in life where you just sleep with one person after another. And sex is more like an exchange, that's all the purpose is. It's just a physical, animalistic kind of self pleasure event, if you will. It's like an event, and it has no higher purpose. And so Paul says, "Hey, because so you don't go fall back." And that's always a good thing. Like, man, Lord, help me not to fall back. Have you ever had those prayers, or those statements, thoughts in your mind? I don't want to fall back. And then when you fall back, you're like, "Oh man, I fell back." And sometimes I remember hearing the term backsliding a lot when I first came to Christ. And that was the idea of kind of like falling back, backsliding, going back into the world kind of thing, and you get the idea where Paul says, "Hey, let's not fall back into just an old pattern, the old lifestyle that we were once doing." And this chapter is challenging because it kind of it makes us have to look at things that we think are kind of like normal patterns in our life or normal things in our life, and it challenges those things, and it makes us go, "Hey, maybe even the default positions that I've always felt were normal, maybe that's something that God wants to work on too." And man, those things can be the toughest because those are the default position. It's like you boot up the computer and you're in the default. You're in the normal, what you always thought was normal. And then you think, man, maybe that's not right. And that's how the Corinthian church was. They're like, "Hey, we've been living this way forever." And then all of a sudden they look at it and they go, "Man, we're starting to seek God, and now maybe we're being challenged on something that has been so normal in our life, but maybe we shouldn't be doing it." And maybe that's not pleasing to God, and maybe that's not in the will of God. And so they're seeking answers, for these things. And it says, the man should give his wife all that is her right as a married woman. So I love that, her right as a married woman. A married woman has rights. What's one of her rights? And it says that the man should give his wife. So a right that a wife has in a marriage, in what Paul is talking about here, is specifically the right to be pleased by her husband. And now that's pretty radical statement, right? A woman has a right. And in that day and age, that probably was a radical moment, a radical little letter there, a statement. And it says the wife should do the same for her husband. So a man has a right, and it's a right for a wife to please her husband. So the woman has a right, and the right for the husband to please the wife. and the wife. Now, I must say this is another challenging section. Ooh, this section, chapter 7, to me is like one of the heavies, and this is why it's so challenging, because a lot of times in our world, it always emphasizes that the man's right is the woman to please the man, where a lot of times you've never heard the other side. And so what happens in our culture is, our culture, the pendulum swings pretty heavy one way or the other. So if it's an emphasis on male pleasure, then it'll swing maybe in the society towards women pleasure, and it kind of can go to extremes on both ends of the spectrum. So they can get out of whack, meaning you don't feel like there's a balance where there's a mutual congruent kind of coherence with male and female and their desires and wants, and those being reciprocated by each other. It seems like they can get out of whack. And the Bible's saying that it should be together. It should be something that's very, if you will, like symmetrical, I guess, where it's working together, as one, where there is a giving of me to my spouse, and my spouse giving of her to me, and a volitional act, something of extreme joy, something that it makes us glad, something that we find incredible richness in, and uh, you know Paul's saying that this is, yeah, a right. This is your right. This is what you have the right for. You should be getting this thing. And the challenging thing comes is, like, you go, well, how do I look at sex? Have I looked at it as me just getting what I want, or have I looked at it as a giving? Have I looked at it as my wife's right is for me to give? And that's what it's about. See, my joy isn't in my self pleasure, but it's my joy is wrapped up in her pleasure and me giving to her. So a lot of times it doesn't, the Christian church has been a little bit like 40 years behind the times in these kind of things, maybe even longer, where, you go to that marriage conference, and it's, the man, loves sex and the woman hates it, but the woman loves to shop and the man hates to shop. And so they do this exchange or something weird like that, where you're blue, he's pink, you're green, she's this. And now, coming from my background, I don't understand any of that. That was kind of like, what? I don't get that. Maybe some of it helped you. I don't know. you know, but coming from my background, I don't know. All I know is the Bible says is that my joy should be wrapped up in giving to my spouse, and my spouse's joy should be wrapped up in giving to me. And this is how Christ lived. His joy was in giving to his bride, his church, laying down his life for his church. For the joy that was set before the Lord, he despised the shame of the cross, right? Hebrews chapter 12. Jesus, was a joyful person in making a bride for himself, paying the price for his bride. This is what Paul's thinking of, right? He just gets done saying, you were bought with a price, therefore glorify God with your body. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We just read that last week, right? Glorify God. Idea of you were bought with a price. Jesus bought you with his own blood. And so he is redeemed you. He has brought you to himself. He has created a bride for him, right? The bride comes to the groom, and there's a wedding feast, and this is how the Bible speaks of our relationship with Jesus in these wedding terms. And so when Paul's not pulling this out of a hat. I guess that's my point too. He's not just pulling this kind of like, hey, let me think of what to say here. No, he's saying, hey, how does Jesus do it? Well, Jesus' joy is in giving to his spouse. And, a lot of times that has never been really emphasized, I think, enough, you know, in maybe the fellowship in churches to men, is that is our joy in the joy of giving. It's better to than to receive. You guys with me? Yes. Okay. So this is really cool. So Paul says this, and he says, verse 4. For a girl who marries no longer has full right over her own body. For her husband then has rights to it too. And in the same way, the husband no longer has full right to his own body, for it belongs also to his wife. Now, this is something that really we struggle with in our day, right? Our bodily autonomy. I have my own rights over my own body. Well, the Bible says when you're married, and you're in agreement, in a covenant marriage, then your body's no longer fully yours. You are now in a covenant with another, and you have to take that into account. So I have rights over my body, but also my spouse has rights over my body too. And of course, it's not for harm. Don't ever think that, because Jesus is our example. He never would do things for our harm, but only for our good. That's right. If someone's hurting you and saying, "Oh, that's my body. I'm going to hurt you." Well, man, you don't obey that. You have to, you have to try to get free and get safe and those kind of things. And yeah, we're told to love our enemies and definitely learn how to deal with our sufferings when we're wronged and all that kind of thing. But let's seek to be safe as well. Man, that's important. Seek to be safe, and but you get the idea here that this was really revolutionary of the day, and even our day, I think, as well, because we want to have our own bodies kind of ruled by ourselves. It's tough for us to go, hey, maybe my wife, she owns a part of my body, and I need to learn to give. And the Christian life is something where this is a part of our life, right? It says your body's not your own, again, 1 Corinthians 6. Your body's not your own. And that's something that when you give your life to Christ, we have to learn how to go, okay, even my own body is no longer mine to do what I want with it. And in a way, we give up that independent, autonomy, that independent full autonomy of our bodies. We're saying, hey, now He is the possessor of this body. And not only that, now I'm in covenant with someone. And now they have a place in my life as well. And sometimes people get married, man, and they don't want to live. They want to be fully autonomous. Man, their wife, they don't want to hear from their husband or their wife at all. They don't want to. They're like, nope, my body's mine, and that kind of idea. And that's a tough situation. But it's not a Christian principle. The Christian principle, like Paul says right here, is for a girl who marries no longer has full right over her own body, but her husband then has rights to it. And in the same way, her husband no longer has full right over his own body, for it belongs to his wife. And then it says, do not refuse each other. Now, what's he getting at? Well, don't refuse each other, meaning don't refuse your intimacy with one another. Don't use your body. Have you ever used your body as like a, like that's how you, show that you're going to get at that person, is by, using sexual, withholding sex or things like that. People do that all the time, and that can be really damaging, man. Hurt people that way. But notice the principle. It says, it says that don't refuse these rights to each other. The only exception to this rule would be for the agreement of both husband and wife to refrain from the rights of marriage for a limited time so that they can give themselves more completely to prayer. Afterward, they should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt them because of their lack of self control. So Paul says, hey, you guys' bodies are one another. It's okay to have intimacy. That's really the point, right? It's okay to come together, to be together. You guys are part of one another. If you're gonna not be intimate, have it be something that's consensual, something for a time, that you guys are in agreement with. And now, what I get out of this too, in a big picture kind of sense, is that in a marriage, in a covenant marriage, there needs to be a lot of communication. You got to be talking with each other. What is your wife like? What is your husband like? Do you guys talk about intimacy? Do you guys express those discussions together? Or is it always just like, oh, this is what he wants, or this is what, da da da, and he's into this, and da da da. Is there any mutual just discussion on those things? And see, you have to discuss, like, hey, do you guys are you guys going to have intimacy, or are you not going to have intimacy? Um, and then be prayerful. Notice it talked about prayer, and fasting, and so that you're not tempted by other things, that you're not going to other things, that you guys are, you know, being, sticking together, that you're not seeking other things, in life. And, this is important, so there's a lot to talk about here on these issues because there's so much communication that should be happening between a husband and a wife. And a lot of times our communication can be we can talk about everything else, but when it comes to sex, for some reason, we feel really weird about that topic. That becomes a really sensitive topic for a lot of people. Maybe it's because they were abused when they were younger, and they just never have worked through that abuse. And a lot of us have had issues, like sexual things, in our past that weren't the best. And you want to work through those things so that you can talk about things. See, God has made us sexual beings, and it's a way that we can not only experience pleasure but see him as pleasurable as well as the creator. And there's a mutual right that we have in marriage to being pleased, um, and it should be with both. It should be mutual. Both people should enjoy that part of their life. It should be an amazing, awesome uh, experience. And that always bums me out when I know of marriages that don't that intimacy is not just a big part of their life. And intimacy, there's many kinds of intimacy too. It doesn't just have to be in the bed. It can be all kinds of other intimacy. Sometimes they're just talking to one another. There can be intimacy there. Sometimes it can be holding hands, or sometimes it can be just hugging each other, just watching a show together, just being together. There's a lot of kinds of intimacy. But you see how there needs to be a mutual enjoyment of one another and a mutual giving of one another. And this all opens up our lives to a lot of vulnerability. And that can be scary. And that's why, these areas are really sensitive because they need to be safe. And Paul understands that. And so he says, hey, pray, fast, talk about it. Nothing's wrong with being intimate. Nothing's wrong with being in a marriage. These are good things. Now Paul's going to go into more, and it's going to even be more radical. It's going to get It's going to get so cool, and there's so many things that are just going to convict us and just be like, whoa, man, and challenge us. But that's good. That's what we need. We always need a little conviction and a little challenging. So I have to remember this morning that, hey, my body's not mine alone. I don't live to myself, the Bible says. I am the Lord's. I am bought with a price. My sexuality is not my own. It is the Lord's. I am to learn how to bring my sexuality underneath the truth of God, the objective truth of God, and that's something that we're always learning to do. I need to learn also to bring my body into a an obedience to what my wife desires, and find my joy in her joy, and that and that we are discussing and talking to one another, and seeking the Lord together, and when it even comes to our intimacy, um, and yeah, so man, wow, you didn't think the Bible would get into all this stuff, did you? Well, it does. It does. It's a cool book, that's for sure. Super awesome. Hey, you guys have a good one. I hope I don't spend too much time in chapter 7 with these little devos, but this is a good one. Now, and just maybe the last thing I could say is if you're not married, um, and you're listening to this, you might go like, "Well, man, this has nothing to do with me." Well, no, it does. First of all, you are still bought with the price. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 says. And then it says, glorify God with your body. And so you have to learn, just like all of us, that your body is not your own. And you have to learn how to communicate with God about your body. And you have to learn how to bring that body into subjection under the will of God. And just like we all do. So, we're all doing this. We all might not be in marital covenant, but we all are learning how to communicate with God, talk to God, say, God, help me to do your will and not my own will. That's the Christian way, right? Not my will, but your will be done. And that's the point of our life. And we have to learn how to even give. And even if you think of being single, learning, sometimes even in friendships, learning how to find your joy in the joy of your friend, finding your joy in the joy of other people. That's just a good principle in general. So anyway, I hope that helps as well. So you guys take care. Hey, I'm glad Michael's out for a walk, and that's awesome. I went on an early morning run today, and that was super fun. There was a lot of people out there. And Tina's in the house, and wonderful sisters in the Lord. Marsha's in the house. Jesus is in the house. He's like a solid rock, man. That guy's always in the house. I love it. So you guys, whoever's listening, whenever you're listening, thank you so much. We'll talk to you guys, Lord willing, tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.